Hi, I'm Ednita Kelly, Children's Librarian at the San Pedro branch of the Los Angeles Public Library, and welcome to today's LA Made program, The Life and Times of Civil Rights Activist Yuri Kochiyama. First, we'd like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, our Library Foundation, and our behind-the-scenes staff for helping bring the LA Made programs to you virtually. LA Made focuses on the diverse landscape of Los Angeles, highlighting the immense artistic and performance talent that has developed in the course of the city's eclectic history. If you would like to see more of our amazing programs, please visit our online calendar at lapl.org/events. And for our LA Made programs specifically, visit lapl.org/LAMade. Our website also has blog posts, video links, and all other kinds of fun things that highlight the library's diverse resources and upcoming programs. Now, on to today's program, The Life and Times of Yuri Kochiyama, a woman who is remembered in very different ways depending on where you're standing. In Harlem, New York, she is famous for her revolutionary activism. But in her hometown of San Pedro, California, she is remembered as the favorite daughter with unlimited school spirit. This presentation reconciles the dichotomy of Kochiyama's identities and shows how they were both rooted in her love and idealism. And giving this amazing presentation today will be my friend Angela Romero, a local historian here in San Pedro who has spent over 10 years studying the history and culture of San Pedro, a harbor community within the city of Los Angeles. In 2009, Angela set off on a quest to walk every street in San Pedro in the span of 9 months. Angela walked, discovered, researched, and created a new dialogue with San Pedrans near and far. She continues to explore and has kept the conversation going for over a decade through walking tours, a monthly column in San Pedro Today magazine, podcasts, and her latest endeavor, the San Pedro Heritage Museum. Created in 2018, the San Pedro Heritage Museum aims to promote the rich history and unique culture of San Pedro that sets the community apart from the rest of LA. So now let's welcome Angela to the stage.
Hi.
Hi, Angela. So first time ever doing a program together. I'm so excited that people get to hear what you have to say.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and do this.
Absolutely. So floor is all yours.
Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of those who are here to learn about Yuri Kochiyama, or as she's known in San Pedro, Mary Nakahara. I have been wanting to research her for quite a while when I first discovered her name in connection with Malcolm X back in my early days of researching San Pedro. So I'm excited to share everything I've learned with you in this program that I created for her centennial that we celebrated this year and back in May. So I'm so excited. Let's get on with the program. Okay, so as Anita said, I'm the president of the San Pedro Heritage Museum, and you can find out more information about our programs. We have a really great program right now called Heritage at Home, where it's a lot like this, where we do presentations online. So next slide, please. So let's get started with the life and times of civil rights activist Yuri Kochiyama. Next slide. My source material for this presentation were two books. The first one is Yuri Kochiyama, Heartbeat of Struggle by Diane C. Fugino, and Yuri's own memoir, Passing It On. And they're great books on her, and also some newspaper articles from our local newspaper, the San Pedro News Pilot. Next slide. Most photos for this presentation have been made available courtesy of the Kochiyama family and also courtesy of the Yuri Kochiyama collection at UCLA. We have a special permission to use the photos from Yuri's memoir. Next slide. So the story of Yuri Kochiyama starts in San Pedro, California in 1921. Next slide, please. Born on May 19th, 1921, 100 years ago in San Pedro, California, were a set of twins to the Nakahara family, Mary Yuriko Nakahara and Peter Minoru Nakahara. They were, back to the first slide, sorry. The twins were pretty opposite, with Mary being the outgoing one and Peter the more shy and reserved. And at this time, the Japanese were not allowed at the San Pedro Hospital, so all of the Japanese children in the area were delivered by the same midwife. Next slide, please. The Nakahara family lived at 893 11th Street, not too far. You can see that big green square, not too far from the high school's athletic field. This is notable because it was a predominantly white neighborhood. Most people of color lived on the northeast side of San Pedro due to redlining, and pretty much 95% of the Japanese in the area lived across the channel on Terminal Island. Next slide. The Nakahara family, pictured here in 1938, consisted of the father, Seiichi Nakahara, mother, Tsuyako, the older brother, Arthur, who's on the far left, and the twins, Peter and Mary. I will tell you more about Mr. Nakahara a bit later. This picture of the family in 1938 is right before Mary and Peter graduated from San Pedro High School. Next slide. Mary had a pretty typical San Pedro upbringing. She went to 15th Street School Elementary, Dana Junior High, and San Pedro High School. She graduated in the summer of 1939, and these candids are from yearbooks spanning her high school career at San Pedro High School. Next slide. Mary was highly active in school activities. Here are some highlights listed next to her senior portrait. I can read it for you. She was vice president of the student body, assistant editor of the Fore and Aft, and historian of the student body. And next slide. She was actually the first girl in school history to ever be elected to vice president or any office above secretary. And the rumor is that she was so popular that if Mary wanted, she could have easily won the presidency. But she ran for vice president and shattered a glass ceiling, and it wouldn't be the first time at San Pedro High School. Next slide. She was a member of the Girls League. Next slide. The assistant, this is her with the staff of the Fore and Aft. And as you're looking at these pictures, just kind of take a quick look at all the people and just see that she is, in most of them, not only the only Asian, but the only person of color. Next slide. Here in the student court, we actually see two other Asian American students, and maybe in the next one as well. But it kind of just gives you the makeup of the demographics of the school and how many people she actually interacted with that were also Asian. But really, it was just always her being the lone Asian American among a predominantly white grouping. Next slide, please. She was also a member of the Girls Athletic Association. And Mary was a huge sports fan. When she was 11 years old, LA hosted the 1932 Olympics, and the Japanese track and field team was actually assigned to practice at Daniels Field, like right by her house. So Mary would go and watch them, and that's when she fell in love with athletics. The Nakahara family would even they actually hosted some of the Olympians in their home for dinners and have special parties for them. Next slide. While Mary herself, she played tennis, but she was actually more enthusiastic about writing for and supporting the high school teams, especially tennis. So when she felt like the boys' tennis team wasn't getting enough coverage from the local newspaper, she volunteered to write the stories herself and actually was given a column. And this caricature by the local artist Pete Bentavoya was presented to Yuri at one of the many celebrations in her honor. And it's really how San Pedrons, the people who remembered her and grew up, she was kind of a legend in her time, and this is how they see her. And one of the famous stories about Mary, and you'll notice I'm trying to keep, I will say no, I'm trying to refer to her as Mary when she calls herself Mary, and then when she makes the change to Yuri, I will point that out. So I'm using Yuri and Mary interchangeably because that's just how I know her. Through the research. So this caricature, the famous story is she would ride her bike everywhere to all of the matches. And some of the matches were actually pretty far out. And this was before freeways, especially before the 110 freeway came all the way to San Pedro. So the famous story is when the tennis team was riding out in the bus to their match at Santa Monica High School, they passed Mary, excuse me, riding along the side of the road, and they picked her up and put her on the bus with them. So that's how dedicated she was to covering these local sports. And often she would be seated right on the bench. They always saved a place for her on the bench because she was so beloved. And this is what made her famous. She was so popular in San Pedro that a couple of years after she left school and was in college, someone thought that there was a fight on the playground at the high school because there was a crowd of people around one person. And when they went up to investigate, it was actually a crowd of people surrounding Mary, wanting to shake her hand because she was so famous. So she was Miss San Pedro for so many people. And I just want to just really drive home how beloved and popular she was here. Next slide, please. So Mary's enthusiasm and school spirit, actually, this is the second glass ceiling that she shatters. It earned her the very first boys' athletic letter given to a girl in school history. And this was long before girls even had their own sports teams and got varsity letters. So I'm going to read this just a little bit. From time to time, yarns having to do with sports in general, but usually associated with tennis, have appeared here under the byline of Mary Nakahara. For the past 4 years, Mary has been one of the best aides possible. Besides writing of all things in the net world, she has picked up items of interest here and there and cleverly told them in stories. Mary is the first girl ever to win a boys' athletic letter at the high school, and it is doubtful that any other girl ever will devote this time she has to high school sports. Mary went on to major in journalism at Compton Junior College. Next slide, please. So after graduating Compton College, Mary was one of the only Japanese Americans working in San Pedro. She was the first Japanese American to be hired by a 5 and dime store. So this building on the right where it says Henry 5, 10, 25 cents, that was actually the location of Woolworths. And Woolworths hired her when 3 other stores wouldn't even let her fill out an application. Next slide, please. Community involvement was also extremely important to Mary, and where she chose to focus her time and her service tells us a lot about her values at the time. On Tuesdays, she ran the Girls Reserves Junior High Club at the YWCA for 7th and 8th grade girls. Next slide, please. And then she also ran the Bluebirds and Campfire Girl groups at Toberman Settlement House that served mostly Hispanic families. These groups help the local children to find interests and make friends. Next slide. This law of the Campfire Girls seemed pretty in tune with Mary's ideals at the time. I'm going to read it. The law of the Campfire Girls were to worship God, seek beauty, give service, pursue knowledge, be trustworthy, hold on to health, glorify work, and be happy. And we're actually fortunate to know how she felt at this time by a writing she did at the age of 18 called My Creed 22. And I'll end the presentation with by reading an excerpt of it. Next slide. Yes. No. Thank you. On Sundays, Mary would teach Sunday school at First Presbyterian Church on 10th and Mesa Streets. After class, all the girls in her class would pile into her car and she'd drive each one of them home. And that's what she was doing on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this is where I'm going to tell you about Mary's father, Seiichi Nakahara. Mr. Nakahara had been established in San Pedro for over 30 years at the time of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. He ran a successful ship chandlery and wholesale fish market, and he was well connected to Japanese dignitaries that he would often host on a local golf course. And because of all of this, he was being watched by the FBI from a rented house across the street from the Nakahara home. Next slide, please. Mr. Nakahara was a childhood friend of Japanese ambassador to the U.S., Admiral Kichisaburo Nomura. A few days before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, The Nakaharas had been expecting the admiral, and unfortunately he sent a telegram saying that he wasn't going to be able to come because he had to go to Washington, D.C. right away. And that in the telegram, he said that he's like, I will miss your sama. And the FBI thought that it was actually code, but sama is actually a type of fish and a delicacy. Back to that slide. Sorry. Mr. Nakahara was actually on December 7th, that Sunday, after Mary had come home from church. Mr. Nakahara was actually recovering from a surgery from a very serious illness and wasn't well. So when the FBI knocked on his door midday, Mary was the one who answered the door for them, and they at that time took Mr. Nakahara into custody and took him to Terminal Island. This was long before any of the Japanese fishermen were taken to Terminal Island. He was taken to Terminal Island and interrogated because of this telegram, even though he wasn't well. And when they finally released him, he was in such poor health that he died weeks later. Next slide, please. A year before Pearl Harbor was bombed, Mary had actually joined the Women's Ambulance and Defense Corps of America. And unfortunately, some of the girls were uncomfortable with the fact that Mary was Japanese, and the instructor asked her not to come back. But she did keep her uniform as a symbol of her patriotism, and it was one of the things that she took with her to the camps as to show her patriotism. And after Pearl Harbor, her brother Peter tried to enlist in all of the different branches of the military, and he was only able to join the Army as a draftee at Fort MacArthur right here in San Pedro. And he ended up working for military intelligence because of his fluency in Japanese. Next slide, please. So the concentration camps. Next slide. Like all the other Japanese Americans and residents, the Nakaharas were forced to pack up their lives into a single suitcase and leave their homes for the Santa Anita Processing Center. And this is here at the Red Car Station in San Pedro. The Nakaharas left San Pedro on April 3rd, 1942. Next slide. Before she left, Mary had taken pictures of all her friends and promised to write them all. And she mentions in her memoir that the Japanese from San Pedro were one of the first groups to arrive at Santa Anita. Next slide. Mary sent many letters to the news pilot in San Pedro, sending her support for the sports teams, as well as reporting on sports within the camp. I'm just going to share this. Just like she kept going, and she kept a correspondence with the news pilots. I'm just going to read this small excerpt. From Santa Anita and Mary Nakahara comes a word of cheer for butt gritters. Mary won't be there in person this fall, as she has been for the past several years, but she says she'll be watching from a long way off and rooting just as hard. So it just shows you what was important to Mary, and keeping some semblance of normalcy in her life, and showing that support that she was famous for. Next slide, please. Besides writing back to the news pilot, Mary actually carried on a lot of her activities that she had done before incarceration. She taught Sunday school in the camps, and her small group of girls wanted to organize as a service organization, so they called themselves the Crusaders. While they felt mostly helpless in the Santa Anita Processing Center, one girl suggested they write letters to Issei soldiers to boost their spirits. Soon the group grew, and they were sending hundreds of letters. And this is much later, but it's kind of like a picture that captures the spirit of the Crusaders. Next slide, please. So Mary continued to grow the Crusaders once she and her family were actually transferred to the Rower concentration camp in Jerome, Arkansas. And here are pictures of her in Arkansas. Soon it kept growing, and the biggest group was actually Mary's group in Arkansas, but there were other groups at other camps. And soon there weren't just the junior Crusaders, there were just the Crusaders, and then there was the junior Crusaders, and then the junior Crusaders, and eventually adult women actually got in on the fun as well. And they were sending tens of thousands of letters all over the world for these servicemen. And Mary kept track of every single letter that she sent out and received in meticulous notes. And I've seen some of these, and it's just crazy how meticulous she was. And she also volunteered in a makeshift USO. So, okay, stay on this slide. When the all-Japanese unit, the 442nd, was created, they were based at Camp Shelby in Mississippi, not very far from Rower in Jerome, Arkansas. And unlike the other GIs, the Japanese soldiers couldn't really travel far on their furlough. So what they would do is they would usually come to the concentration camp in Jerome, and Mary was one of the people who would greet them and, really handle the logistics of their lodging and stuff like that. Next slide, please. So it was while she was doing all of this logistical and processing that she met her future husband, Bill Kochiyama. After a short courtship, they wanted to get married. And when Mary traveled to Mississippi to marry him, unfortunately, Bill's father sent a telegram asking them to hold off on the nuptials instead until he could meet Mary first. And so instead of returning to Jerome, she actually accepted a position at the Aloha USO in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. So this is a picture of her during her time there. Next slide, please. So after the war, the Nakaharas were able to return to their home in San Pedro. Their neighbors actually cared for their home, rented it out for them, and made sure that the renters were gone by the time the Nakaharas were able to return. And, for so many Japanese in San Pedro, the Nakaharas were very fortunate to have held on to their property because they own the home. And so many people, like the other Japanese on Terminal Island, after the Japanese were removed from the island, the entire village was razed. So a lot of people, even if they wanted to come back to San Pedro, couldn't. And so Mary stuck around San Pedro, waiting for Bill to finish his service in the army. And, she tried to get a job. And most places in San Pedro, although she was the beloved, Miss San Pedro before the war, they wouldn't hire her because she was Japanese. And the jobs that she did get were waitressing jobs at bars and cafes on notorious Beacon Street that was super dangerous in the middle of the night. And even then, those jobs were short-lived and would be until someone had an issue with her, or until someone threw like a hot cup of coffee at her, and then she was done. Next slide. So she went to New York City. Next slide, please. In January of 1946, Mary took a bus all the way to New York City to be with Bill. And they were married shortly after. On their wedding day, it was February 9th, 1946. They lived in a dingy flat with shared bathrooms and vermin. And unfortunately, racism prevented Bill from finding gainful employment for quite a while. Next slide, please. One of Mary's first jobs, because she had gotten so much fast and loose experience with waitressing, she got a job at the coffee chain Chock full of Nuts. And her coworkers were predominantly Black, and they called it the Plantation. And it was here that Mary began to learn about racism experienced by African Americans, because she didn't have a lot of experience growing up with Black people, because there just weren't that many in San Pedro. Next slide. Soon the Kochiyamas started a family. They lived in a one-room bedroom apartment when their first child, Billy, was born. And there's young Billy and the grandfather. Next slide, please. In 1948, before their second child, Audie, was born, the Kochiyamas moved into the newly opened Amsterdam Houses housing project near the future site of Lincoln Center. Next slide, please. In the 12 years that the Kochiyamas spent at the Amsterdam Houses, the family grew to 8. So there was Bill, Mary, and their 6 children: Billy, Audie, Aichi, Eddie, Jimmy, and Tommy, and they're all pictured here having cake with their grandfather. Next slide, please. So this is Harlem. Next slide, please. In 1960, the Kochiyamas would move to the new Manhattanville projects in Harlem. This is where Mary's life would be changed forever. Next slide, please. Mary and Bill had a huge group of friends between them, and they were always hosting visitors. One practice they started was having Saturday open houses where people could stop by. They even invited speakers to come talk at these salons. The salons grew over the years, giving the Kochiyama home the nickname of Grand Central Station. This picture is of Bill, Audie, and Mike Hernandez. Mike Hernandez was a boy from Wilmington. He had Hodgkin's lymphoma, and his dream was always to go to New York City. And I believe his teacher wrote to Mary asking to kind of host him, and they did. And they actually they really showed him the town and kept up a rapport, and they accepted him as family. And unfortunately, Mike died not long after returning back from home, like within the next year. Next slide, please. So Yuri famously called Harlem her school without walls, and she wasted no time starting her education and activism. Her proximity to the activities going on in Harlem put her in contact with people who were fighting for civil rights. And in 1963, she began attending protests with CORE, and CORE stands for Congress on Racial Equality. And she also got involved with the Harlem Parents Committee. Both organizations were fighting for racial equality and equity in hiring and education. And she started taking her children to some of these these protests, and she and her son Billy were actually arrested with 600 others protesting racist hiring practices at a local hospital that was being built. Next slide, please. Mary also attended the Harlem Freedom School put together by the Harlem Parents Committee, and these were some of her instructors: James Baldwin, Fannie Lou Hamer, Richard Moore, and John Henrik Clark. Next slide, please. Okay, so when Mary had to go to court for her arrest at the protest for the hospital hiring, Malcolm X happened to be appearing there the same day. And as Black people started crowding around him, Mary stayed to the back, and she let them kind of go forward and have their moment. But she really wanted to meet him. And when he looked at her, she took the opportunity, and she called out to him, asking if she could shake his hand. And this is their exchange. It's actually quite legendary. And so she's like, "Can I shake your hand?" And he's like, "What for?" And she answers, "To congratulate you." And he's like, "For what?" And she's like, "For what you're doing for your people." And he's like, "And what's that?" And her answer was, "For giving them direction." And Malcolm X's face changed, and he goes up and he shakes Mary's hand. And this meeting would have one of the largest impacts on Mary's activism. Mary began writing to Malcolm X, and he even sent postcards. And then when the Hibakishas, which were a group of women who survivors of the Americans bombing Japan with the nuclear weapons, they wanted to meet Malcolm X, and so she invited him to come meet them at one of her salons, and he showed up. And so this picture was taken that night, and her daughter's there in the front. So this picture was taken at their home. Next slide, please. So while Mary didn't agree at the time with Malcolm's self-determination, she did admire his service to the poor, his search for truth and courage, and to speak regardless of potential persecution. Malcolm X, in turn, asked Mary to join his organization of Afro-American Unity. So that's from June 1964. Next slide, please. So I'm going to warn you, this is the next photo depicts Malcolm X's assassination. Next slide, please. So Mary was in the audience on February 21st, 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom the day Malcolm X was assassinated. And as soon as the shots rang out, Mary instinctively ran towards the stage in concern for Malcolm's life. And then this famous photo appeared in Life magazine of her cradling his head. Next slide, please. So by the mid-1960s, where, Mary initially didn't agree with self-determination, but that changed very quickly as she got more and more active with Black nationalism. So her political views had gone from integration and nonviolence to self-determination and self-defense. In 1968, she joined the Republic of New Africa and chose to go by her Japanese middle name, Yuri, as a way of decolonization. So this is when we make the change from Mary Nakahara, Mary Kochiyama to now Yuri Kochiyama. And that's how she identifies herself for the rest of her life. She became an integral part of the radical Black movement by using her writing and logistics skills that she learned during World War II. And she was the natural networker, and she just, all of the stuff that she did, writing letters, connecting people, all that stuff she did for the Crusaders came into perfect service for the Black nationalism movement. Okay, next slide, please. So as a Black nationalist, Yuri was explicitly anti-imperialism. She believed that people had a right to fight imperialism by any means necessary. She also fought hard for the release of political prisoners. And Yuri was often the first person people called when they were arrested or released because of her connections. In 1977, Yuri took part in occupying the Statue of Liberty to protest the imprisonment of Puerto Rican nationalists who had been imprisoned since their 1954 attack on Congress. So what they did is they stormed the Statue of Liberty, climbed the stairs, and flew the Puerto Rican flag from the crown of the Statue of Liberty. Next slide, please. So in her activism for Black nationalism and even political prisoners, Yuri was much happier in a service role, and eventually she felt more comfortable taking the lead in the Asian activist movement, especially during the Japanese American redress movement that successfully petitioned the government to admit to the denial of civil rights of Japanese Americans during World War II. Next slide, please. Eventually, Yuri became a mentor for younger Asian American activists and has now become a hero of human rights activism. And here she is with her granddaughter and Angela Davis. Next slide, please. So in 2016, Google honored Yuri with a posthumous Google Doodle on her 95th birthday. This stirred controversy because of Yuri's controversial support for political figures like Osama bin Laden, and even her support for the political prisoners and for the stunt at the Statue of Liberty is extremely controversial because they attacked Congress and there were people who were wounded. They shot at Congress. So I think that Yuri should be celebrated. And so in the last slide, like I said, she is seen as a hero of human rights activism, but I think that there is a little bit of a danger of removing most of her activism because a lot of it is controversial because her being a Black nationalist and the United States being an imperialist country. So I think that it's completely honest for people to support her and see her as a mentor, but also you have to take everything and including the controversial parts. Next slide, please. So this mural is in Harlem and it links Yuri and Malcolm. And so I should also mention that Yuri and Malcolm share the same birthday. He's a few years younger than her, and so they have the same. The May 19th is both their birthdays, and they had human rights and Black nationalism in common, and it all centers in Harlem. And this, in celebration of Yuri's centennial this year, they actually had a project where they touched up the mural and had like a rededication this year. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to read excerpts from My Creed 22. And she wrote this in 1939 when she was 18 years old. And the full thing can be found in Passing It On by Yuri Kochiyama, her memoir that I mentioned as a source material. My Creed 22. To never humiliate or look down on any person, group, creed, religion, nationality, race, employment, or station in life, but rather to respect. To love everyone, to never know the meaning of hate or have one enemy. To stay on the same side of the track as whoever I am with, but still live within the limits of my own ideals. Regardless of whether my actions seem wrong in the eyes of society, I will do that which I am doing as long as I am not infringing on the happiness of another, hurting another, and as long as I can look at myself without feeling ashamed. To never expect another to be indebted to help me, but should I be able to help anyone, to be grateful that I could be of use. To give the advantage, but never ask for it, to be strict with myself, but not with others, to be humble enough to stoop to any degree as long as it is in service for another. And this creed I call 22. It is my philosophy of life. Dear Heavenly Father, help me live it. And I do believe she did. Next slide. Oh, we're done. So I will now gladly take questions.
Okay, so while we're waiting for them to pop up any questions that may have come up, I have a ton of questions that I've been writing down. The first one that I had was, why did they end up moving to New York?
So Bill was from New York.
Okay.
He grew up there. His father, it was interesting because I don't know much about his mother, and I think she might have died when he was a baby or something. But his father worked as kind of like a butler or like a caretaker for large estates, and because it was just the two of them, he couldn't care for Bill as a child, and so Bill grew up in an orphanage, and he called them his brothers and sisters, but he had a ton of friends, and they grew up. And I think that's kind of like an East Coasty thing where you weren't necessarily an orphan, but you could grow up in an orphanage. So she just wanted to be with him, and he wanted to go back home to where he was more comfortable.
Roots, yeah. Oh wow.
And
But I asked that.
And I will also add that so the two housing projects that they lived in, that was just very common in the United States after World War II, that servicemen got preferential to get into these housing projects, like coming back from the war.
Okay. Another thing I wanted to know was, what did her family back home, friends and family back home in San Pedro, what did they think about her activism, and did they even know about it?
So the crazy thing about that is they had this this annual, it was kind of like, it's weird to call it a newsletter, but it was called Christmas Cheer. But it was like, it seemed like it was like a full newspaper, because it just took so long for them to produce. And then as she got more active, it stopped being about like the kids and what they were in the family, and more about their activism. And so eventually it got so filled with activism, because she, it seems like when she was into something, she was in all the way. And so some of the people were like, and so they kind of like pushed back a little bit, and she stopped it. And then she just started one called like the North Star, specifically about like all of the things that she was into, like the movement and activism and stuff like that.
How many years did her activism span, would you say? Like, at what point in her life did she begin it? And then it was probably until the day she died? Is she
So,
still alive?
right. No, I think, believe maybe 2011. I'm not
Okay.
really sure.
Uh-huh.
She passed away, and she, yeah, at one point she even like had to make a decision that, because she was still working while she was doing all this activism, because she had to help provide for her large family.
Mhm.
So at one point, as she was, a little bit older and the kids had kind of moved off, she made a conscious decision to be a full-time activist.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned that she was still working. So I was actually wondering about that too. I'm like, so did she hold jobs while she did this? Or like, did her husband just support her? Okay. Any questions coming in from the audience? Oh, here we go. Did Yuri ever go back to San Pedro High School to give presentations on her life?
On her life, no. And I will say, because you also asked about, people around town, like,
Mhm.
wanting to, like, how they felt about her activism. So when in doing my research for this presentation, there was, so in the news pilot, if you were to search for Yuri Kochiyama, the name Yuri Kochiyama only comes up twice and she was in the 50s and 60s, like, or say, like, so she changed her name in the 1960s. The name Yuri Kochiyama only appears twice in the local newspaper because they knew her as Mary Nakahara, and even so, when she comes to town, they don't call her Yuri Kochiyama; they call her Mary Kochiyama,
Mhm.
because that's how they know her. But no one ever talks about like what she did, like, not even like, hey, there was, remember that lady from Mary Nakahara? She like just occupied the Statue of Liberty. Like, nothing. It's like it does. That's why I talk about the dichotomy of, it's either Yuri Kochiyama in Harlem or Mary Nakahara in San Pedro, and it's like they're two different people.
It's funny
But
because it's like if Facebook had existed back then, they would have blew up her spot. They would have been like, "Do you know what this lady from town is doing?" You know what I mean? Like, that's
yeah,
funny that people didn't know.
yeah. So
They
for
didn't talk
sure,
about it.
and so but she would, and that's the thing, is when she came back to town, she was a celebrity. Like, even in the 1960s, in the night, so after the war in the 1960s, she came back to visit. Whenever she came back to visit her family, there was something in the newspaper saying, Mary Kochiyama is here in town if you want to see her. They did like a "This Is Your Life," like, for her at, like, I think it was like Point Furman Park on the stage, and where people were like like surprising her, like, do you know this voice? Oh, that's so and so. And like, literally they would sell out, like, oh, Mary's in town. Who wants to have lunch with her on the there was this boat restaurant called the Princess Louise, and they're like, who wants to have lunch with Mary? And like 200 people like bought tickets, and it was an impromptu reunion. And so she didn't even have to show up for school reunions. Reunions would just happen around her. And that, I'm telling you, like, I don't know how to, besides saying stuff like that, like, to express how popular she was.
That's
She was
insane.
like a celebrity,
Yeah.
but completely like blinders on to like the activism that she was doing. It was just
Mhm.
but it was that kind of like keep your politics at the door kind of
Right,
thing.
right. Huh.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Hey, this is for my dad. How did her life impact her family life? Was her husband on board?
So, yes, he was on board, but I will say it was a struggle. And so let's talk about these salons and how uh, she was she was hospitable to a fault. And like, calling her house that nickname Grand Central Station was no joke. Like, the kids had, so she had, 6 kids, and the kids, and she would like house people, especially as she really got active in like Black nationalism. They would have full-on meetings at her house, and she would host people, and then like the kids would have to be staying at their friends' houses or staying in one room together. And like these apartments weren't very big, and so there was like people like laying on like the ground. And so like it did, and the kids were like, and they absolutely believed in like in the movement, like her son Billy, and a lot of the older kids really got in on the activism, like Aichi, who her second oldest daughter, her youngest daughter, because she only had two, but like Aichi's name, I can't remember what her actual name is, but she was the first one who started going by her Japanese name instead of her American name because of the movement. And so the kids were like, they were absolutely committed to the movement, but it was like, but can the movement not be in my house? And it was hard because like the other thing that was really cool about Yuri is that she was an archivist and a historian, and like myself, we're kind of hoarders because information is important, and so like the collection of stuff, like it was overwhelming for them. And I think the word I would say overwhelming. And so it was a struggle. It was like, it was really cool to be part of it, but it was also, I think, and that's what I got from reading the books, is that it was a bit of a struggle, but it was something that they gave up to the movement.
Thank you. Okay, from 6010. Given her association with X, do you know if she ever came across formal socialist organizations like the CPUSA, Black Panthers, etc., and what she thought of them, or socialist thought in general?
I don't know the CPUSA, but she was very connected, and she knew all the people, and for her, whether she agreed with you or not, she felt that there was common ground between everyone. And so I don't want to say like, yes, she like was totally cool with socialism, because I can't remember that part, but I will say that even if she didn't agree with you, she found a way to on whatever you agreed on, because it would help the movement. She didn't like separating people. She liked bringing people together, because even if you were like, there was just always something to agree upon, and you can be used in service for the movement. So I hope that answers some part of your question, but yeah.
I had another question that I didn't write down, and now I have to try to remember it. But while I try to remember it, I want to know if she was ever targeted by the FBI, like you hear about other activists. Were they?
Sorry, yes, she was.
Mm.
She was, because of her activism with within the Black nationalist movement. She was. There is absolutely a dossier on her.
Okay. Diane wants to know, besides the books mentioned, are there other library resources you would recommend for research?
Library resources. So there's the LA Library has the picture collection on Japanese incarceration during World War II. Anything on Japanese incarceration. Black nationalism. But as far as research, I didn't use the unfortunately, I'm sorry, I didn't use the LA Library, because they don't have. Well, there's the LA Times. You can access the historical LA Times through the LA Library ProQuest, which is a great tool.
Thank you. Okay. I have a question. The first time I saw this presentation, when you shared it with me privately, you had drawn a conclusion about the thought about her radicalization. Do you remember that?
I will. Yes, I'll share that. So because I knew a little bit about Yuri Kochiyama and some of her political activism, when I finally sat down to read these books to learn about her, I had thought that I would find someone who was radicalized because of her experience in the concentration camps during World War II. Yuri very much considered herself like she mentions in her memoir where she called herself apple pie American. And so someone who has these big eyes, and I will tell you about when you grew up in San Pedro, and so I feel like a kinship with her because I am also born and raised in San Pedro, in a community that is famous for its diversity. And we didn't have like ethnic enclaves. Everyone was like living right next to each other, and even she was living in a predominantly white neighborhood. You kind of accept that this is what life is, and it's that, you know, everyone's getting, as long as, you know, you're just being cool, like everyone's fine with each other. She really didn't experience any very much racism in her youth, and she thought everything was hunky-dory, and called herself an apple pie American. and and it wasn't until, you know, like the year before Pearl Harbor, as tension starts growing with Japan, that she starts experiencing um, racism. And like, so she had that experience that I mentioned in the program with joining the Women's Ambulance Defense Corps, and that some of the girls being like uncomfortable that she was Japanese and asking her to leave. Like that was, but she didn't consider that racism. She thought that the girls were just being mean.
Mm.
And then even after like her dad getting taken by the FBI and being, you know, mistreated or like denied his medication or whatever, so that he ended up dying weeks later, she didn't even consider that racism. It was just something unfortunate that happened. She was in putting up, after, this is after Pearl Harbor was bombed, she's putting up flyers for the student, I think, alumni group. And the cops question her and take her down to the station because they think that the color of the paper is like code. And, you know, but she even doesn't she doesn't, still at this time, does not consider that racism. And so I was thinking that I was going to find someone who's, once she's in the camps and she's separated and kept away from people, that she's going to think that she gets radicalized and like, this is wrong. And I'm going to like, you know, be this person. And she even says, no, it wasn't. It wasn't until she goes to Harlem and she starts just paying attention to what's going on in her neighborhood. And she starts learning, and she's going to the Freedom School, and she gets this education about what the plight of, you know, the racism faced by African Americans. And then being like, oh, wait, so in hindsight, seeing all of those things that happened to her as racism and being, you know, and but even then, like, it was what she witnessed happening in Harlem and in New York that essentially radicalized her. And it was in talking, because in the beginning, like when she first met Malcolm X, she was not someone, like, she didn't agree with, you know, like, you know, Malcolm X is famous for that by any means necessary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, but can't we all like just, you know, like, it's all about integration if we work together. And he's like, no, you don't understand. The America is built, you know, to keep Black people out, you know, and to keep Black people in it's a racist country. And so he's like, the only way that we can prosper is if we are running our own society. And she was like, I don't get it, but I like what you're doing. Again, so even though she doesn't agree with him, she finds a way that they do agree, and that makes her more open to his ideas, so that a couple years later she's a full-blown Black nationalist.
Wow.
So yeah, so she wasn't like, I had expected her to have been radicalized in the camps, but she wasn't.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Looks like we have two more questions. I'll read them real quick. Sanam wants to know, does her family want to continue celebrating her legacy, or do they shy away because of how some people view her as a controversial figure?
No, they absolutely still celebrate her legacy, and they are still very much part of the movement.
Nice, thank you. And then last question, how is she viewed within the Japanese community, locally outside of the general San Pedro community?
She's seen as a very important figure for Japanese, for human rights, and because of her movement for greater equality and equity for all people. And she's kind of like saying deified is, or, you know, or canonized. Like, I just feel like right now there's this trend to kind of look for people to look up to and only take an aspect of them. And that's kind of why emphasize how controversial she was.
Mm-hmm.
And so she is absolutely celebrated as, the mentor and the leader that she is for Asian American rights, and because of her work and her, and that's the other thing, is that the spirit that she was celebrated for in San Pedro, having that that
Can do,
mm-hmm. Nothing is impossible, like we can all get together and be friends and do this thing, even though it was for sports, she took that, so that's what I'm saying, we see her as two different people, but she herself never changed. She was always idealistic. She was always willing to bring people together. She was always willing to write about people doing the right thing, whether they were really good tennis players or activists, who are fighting for racial justice and stuff like that. She never changed ever. It was only her consciousness that expanded, and she used her whole person and her whole effort in service of what her ideals were at the time. And so they never changed. They just expanded over time.
Perfect. I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you, Angela, so much. I hope the people who are watching this now and later got to learn something really interesting about a San Pedro native, Yuri Kochiyama. If you want to find out more about what Angela is doing with her museum, you can go to www.sanpedroheritage.org. And we hope to see you again. Thank you for spending the afternoon with us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Cool. All right, guys, if you're still with us, we want to thank you so much for joining us today for today's LA Made program. And remember to check out the library's online calendar at lapl.org/events.
Thank you so much, Ednita, for hosting and for doing an amazing job out at San Pedro Public Library. You can find Anita there. She's an amazing children's librarian. And thanks to Angela. There's such an amazing program. There was lots of great comments. And my name is Diana Lebo-Posner. I am the principal librarian for the Exploration and Creativity Department. And I want to have a special invitation to everybody for a special LA Made this Saturday at 10 a.m. And it will be right here on YouTube and Facebook. We have a special cooking program in Español, in Spanish, Comida Salvadorana Deliciosa. Alicia Maher, the Gourmand Award-winning local author of El Salvador Sabroso Delicioso and Delicious El Salvador. Alicia will demonstrate how to make classic Salvadorian dishes. She will show viewers how to prepare Salvadorian tortillas, leche polada, and more from scratch. I can't wait. And as I said earlier, this program will be presented in Spanish, and those attending this program will have an opportunity to win a free copy of one of Alicia's cookbooks. We do have some in Spanish and some in English. Awesome. Over to you, Anita.
Thank you, Diane, for coming on to give that advertisement for the program, because I did not want to mess that up. Okay, everyone, until next time, we truly appreciate all of your support. The success of LA Made and all of our library programs could not happen without viewers like you. So thank you, and we will see you again at the next program. Bye, everyone.